I wrote their names down as we took their grain, and I told myself that writing it made it proper. I was a clerk in a former schoolhouse in Tambov province. The desks where children once practiced their letters had been pushed against the walls, replaced by ledgers, orders, and confiscation lists. The roof no longer kept out the snow, and the chalk dust had long since settled into the floorboards, beneath the weight of boots and damp wool coats. I had been a teacher for 15 years. I taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to the children of peasants. And now I used those same skills to record how much grain we took from their families. My name is Mikhail Arsenyev, and I used to believe that words could save us. The winter of 1920 came early to Tambov province, and with it came the requisition squads. I remember standing in the doorway of what had once been my schoolhouse, now converted into a district Soviet office, watching the first snow fall through the broken slats of the roof. The desks where children had practiced their letters were pushed against the walls, replaced by a long table covered in ledgers and confiscation orders. The smell of chalk dust had given way to tobacco smoke and the musty odor of damp wool coats. I was 38 years old that autumn, though I felt decades older. My hands, which had once held only books and pieces of chalk, now regularly touched a rifle. The transformation had not been sudden. Few transformations in those years were. It had crept over me like frost on a window pane, so gradually that I barely noticed until one morning I woke and no longer recognized myself. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of Kirsonov, a market town that had swelled and contracted with the fortunes of war. Before 1914, it had been a place of modest prosperity. Grain merchants, a few small factories, orchards that produced apples traded as far as Moscow. The Great War had drained it of men. The revolution had drained it of certainty. Now, under War Communism, it was being drained of everything else. I had been conscripted into the Red Army in 1919, though conscripted perhaps dignifies what was closer to a sweep through the town's remaining able-bodied men. My eyesight was poor. I wore wire-rimmed spectacles that were always sliding down my nose, and my constitution had never been robust. But I could read and write with facility in Russian, and passably in French and German. This made me valuable not as a soldier, but as a clerk, a recorder, a man who could transform the messy reality of requisition into neat columns of figures. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent 15 years teaching peasant children their letters, drilling them in grammar and arithmetic, filling their heads with Pushkin and Lermontov. Now I was using those same skills to document the seizure of their family's grain. On the morning of October 12, 1920, I sat at my table in the schoolhouse and reviewed the latest orders from the provincial committee. The quota for Kirsonov district had been raised again, 40,000 puds of grain, plus additional requisitions of potatoes, meat, and fodder. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and the typing was faint, but the numbers were clear enough. I did the mathematics automatically, a habit from years of teaching. 40,000 puds, roughly 655 tons, from a district that had already been requisitioned 4 times since spring. Comrade Baranov entered without knocking. He was the local commissar, a man of perhaps 30, with a face that seemed carved from the same gray stone as the old fortress walls. He had come from Petrograd in the summer, sent to ensure the grain quotas were met. His devotion to the cause was absolute, his capacity for doubt apparently non-existent. "Arsenyev," he said, dropping a canvas satchel on my table. "Today we go to Afanasyevka." I looked up from my ledger. Afanasyevka was requisitioned 3 weeks ago, and they concealed grain. We have reports. He pulled out a folded paper, a denunciation written in a barely literate hand. Someone in the village had informed on their neighbors. It happened more and more now. Hunger had a way of loosening old loyalties. "Who signed this?" I asked. Baranov's expression didn't change. "That's not relevant to your duties, Comrade Arsenyev. Your duty is to record what we collect, to ensure proper accounting. We leave in 1 hour. Bring your ledger." After he left, I sat for a long moment staring at the denunciation. The handwriting was familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. Perhaps a former student. Perhaps someone whose children I had taught. The thought made my stomach clench. Through the broken roof slats, snow continued to fall. It accumulated in thin lines on my table, on the pages of my ledger, melting into small, wet spots that blurred the ink. I thought about closing the ledger, putting it away, walking out through the back door and simply continuing to walk until I was somewhere, anywhere else. But where would I go? Desertion meant execution. And even if I could escape that, what was there to escape to? The whole country was caught in the same machinery now. The same requisitions, the same hunger, the same grinding logic that said the city workers must eat, so the peasants must give. And if they will not give, then it must be taken. I cleaned my spectacles with a corner of my shirt and began copying the day's orders into my personal notebook. I had started keeping 2 sets of records, the official ledger and my own private account. I wasn't certain why. Perhaps I thought that someday someone would want to know what actually happened here, beyond the numbers in the official reports. Perhaps I thought that if I wrote it down clearly enough, I could make sense of it myself. The squad assembled in front of the schoolhouse just after 9 o'clock. There were 12 of us. Baranov, myself, 8 Red Army soldiers, most of them local conscripts like me, though younger, and 2 men from the Cheka. The Cheka men wore leather coats despite the cold, and they carried Nagant revolvers in holsters at their belts. Their presence was meant to discourage resistance. It usually worked. We walked rather than rode. The horses had long since been requisitioned, and fuel for the few motorized vehicles was reserved for more important missions. The road to Afanasyevka was a muddy track that wound through fields of stubble, wheat and rye already harvested, the stalks cut close to the ground. In summer, these fields would have been golden. Now they were the color of old bone, dusted with snow. No one spoke much as we walked. The soldiers smoked rough tobacco rolled in newspaper. One of them, a boy named Fyodor, who couldn't have been more than 19, walked beside me for a while. "Comrade Arseniev," he said quietly, "you taught in Afanasyevka before the war, didn't you?" I nodded. 2 years, 1911 and 1912. There was no school in the village, so I held classes in the church. "Do you remember the families?" "Some of them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My cousin married a girl from Afanasyevka, Daria Grigorievna. Do you remember her?" I did, though I didn't say so. A slight girl with quick hands, good at sums. She would be a woman now, probably with children of her own. "I remember a Daria," I said carefully. "It's a common name." Fyodor nodded and fell back to walk with the other soldiers. I understood what he had been asking. He wanted to know if this would be difficult, if we would know the people whose grain we were taking, if it would feel personal. The answer, I had learned, was that it was always personal and never personal at the same time. The families would be people I knew, had taught, had shared bread with, and they would also be names in a ledger, entries in a quota, obstacles to be overcome in service to the revolution. We had learned to hold both truths simultaneously, and the cognitive dissonance had stopped feeling like dissonance. It had become simply the way things were. Afanasyevka appeared in the distance around mid-morning, a cluster of wooden houses, perhaps 60 in all, arranged around a muddy square with a well at its center. The church, where I had once taught, stood at the far end of the village, its dome a faded blue that had once been vibrant. Smoke rose from some of the chimneys, thin gray threads against the white sky. As we approached, I saw faces appear at windows, then quickly disappear. A door closed. Children who had been playing near the well were called inside. By the time we entered the square, the village seemed almost deserted, though I could feel eyes watching from behind shuttered windows. Baranov stopped in the center of the square and called out, "I am Commissar Baranov of the Tambov Provincial Committee. We are here to collect grain requisitioned by order of the Soviet government. All households are to bring their surplus grain to the square immediately. Failure to comply will result in a complete search of premises and severe penalties." His voice echoed in the stillness. No one emerged. After a minute, Baranov turned to the soldiers. "Begin with the house on the left. Comrade Arsenyev, you will record everything we find." The first house belonged to a family named Volkov. I remembered the father, Grigory Volkov, a solid man with a black beard, a lay reader at the church. We knocked, and after a long pause, the door opened. Grigory stood in the doorway. He looked older than I remembered, his beard now shot through with gray. His eyes moved from Baranov to me, and I saw recognition there, followed by something like sadness. "Mikhail Ivanovich," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." "Grigory Petrovich," I replied, and found I couldn't meet his gaze. Baranov pushed past him into the house. The soldiers followed. I came last, my ledger open, my pencil ready. The search was thorough and invasive. They checked the cellar, the loft, the space beneath the floorboards. In the corner of the main room, Volkov's wife sat with 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The girl might have been 7 or 8. She stared at us with enormous dark eyes. In the cellar they found 4 sacks of rye, perhaps 3 puds total. Baranov ordered it brought up. "This is seed grain," Volkov said, his voice carefully controlled. "For spring planting. Without it we cannot sow." "Surplus grain is to be requisitioned," Baranov replied. "You should have delivered it voluntarily." "It's not surplus. It's seed. My family cannot eat it and also plant a crop. We will have nothing." One of the Cheka men stepped forward. "Are you refusing to comply with the requisition?" The question hung in the air. We all knew what refusal meant. Volkov looked at his wife, at his children. His hands, I noticed, were trembling. "No," he said finally. "I am not refusing." I wrote in my ledger, "Volkov, Grigory Petrovich, 3 puds rye, October 12th, 1920. We moved from house to house. The pattern repeated with variations. Some families had more grain, some less. Some had hidden it cleverly, in haystacks, in false floors, in sealed jars buried in gardens. Some, I suspected, had nothing left to hide. The mood in the village shifted as the morning wore on, from sullen compliance to barely suppressed anger. At the 5th house, an old woman spat at Baranov's feet. "You're stealing food from the mouths of children," she said. "The cities are full of thieves and Bolsheviks, and they eat while we starve. May God curse you." Baranov didn't react. "Your attitude is noted, grandmother. If you have information about concealed grain, it would be wise to share it." "I have nothing but curses for you." We searched her house anyway. Found 2 sacks of potatoes and a small amount of millet. I recorded it. By early afternoon, we had collected perhaps 20 puds of grain total, nowhere near the village's quota. The grain was loaded onto a cart that one of the soldiers had commandeered from a barn. The villagers watched from their doorways, silent now, their faces hard. Before we left, Baranov addressed the village again. Afanasyevka has not met its requisition quota. We will return next week. I suggest you find what you have hidden. The revolution will be fed. Your cooperation is not optional. As we began the walk back to Kirsanov, pulling the cart behind us, Fyodor fell into step beside me again. "Did you see her?" he asked. "Daria, I mean, my cousin's wife." "No," I lied. "I didn't." I had seen her. She had been in the 7th house we searched, standing behind her husband with a baby on her hip. She had recognized me, too. I had seen it in her eyes. But neither of us had spoken. What would we have said? The walk back seemed longer than the walk out. The cart wheels stuck in the mud. The soldiers were quiet, tired. I thought about the faces I had seen, the fear and anger barely concealed. I thought about the girl in the Volkov house with her enormous eyes. I thought about seed grain taken and spring crops that would never be planted. That night, in my room in the dormitory attached to the schoolhouse, I sat by candlelight and made my private notes. I wrote down the names I remembered, the amounts taken, the things people had said. I wrote about Volkov's trembling hands and the old woman's curse. I wrote until the candle burned low and my hand cramped. Then I closed the notebook and sat in darkness, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Otherwise, the town was silent. I wondered how long the silence would last. The first open resistance came 3 weeks later, though the signs had been building like storm clouds on the horizon. It was late October now, and the requisitions had intensified. Baranov received new orders almost daily: higher quotas, expanded searches, stricter penalties for concealment. The provincial committee in Tambov city was under pressure from Moscow, and they passed that pressure down to us like a weight that grew heavier with each transfer. I spent my days filling ledgers with figures that no longer meant anything beyond their own grim arithmetic. Potatoes requisitioned, flour confiscated, livestock seized. Each entry was a family pushed closer to hunger. Each column of numbers was a village's margin of survival reduced to nothing. The mood in Kirsanov had changed. When I walked through the market square, though there was little enough to market now, conversations would stop as I passed. People I had known for years would turn away. Once, a woman whose daughter I had taught actually spat on the ground as I walked by. She didn't spit at me precisely, but near enough that the message was clear. I couldn't blame her. I was complicit. I knew this with the same certainty that I knew multiplication tables or the declensions of Latin nouns. The fact that I was following orders, that I was merely recording rather than deciding, that I too had been conscripted into this machinery, none of that mattered. The ledger was in my hand. The numbers were in my writing. I was part of the mechanism. On November 3rd, everything changed. I was in the schoolhouse that morning reviewing the week's requisition totals when I heard shouting from the square. Not the normal noise of the market, but something sharper, more urgent. I went to the window and saw people running. Baranov appeared in my doorway moments later, his face flushed. "There's been an incident in Kamenka. One of the requisition squads was attacked." Kamenka was a village perhaps 15 versts south of Kirsanov, deep in the forest country. I had never taught there, it was too isolated, but I knew it by reputation.
a place of small farms and deep suspicion of outsiders even before the revolution. Attacked how? I asked. Armed peasants. They ambushed the squad on the road, killed 3 soldiers and a commissar, took the requisitioned grain and fled into the forest. He was already pulling on his coat. The district committee is sending a punitive detachment. You're coming with us. Why do you need a clerk to record everything, to make an official report? This is insurrection, Arsenyev. It needs to be documented properly. The punitive detachment left Kirsanov that afternoon, 50 armed men, including a machine gun crew and several more Cheka agents. I rode in a supply wagon with my ledger and a satchel of papers, watching the countryside roll past. The forests here were dense, oak and birch mixing with stands of pine, and the road was barely more than a track. Perfect country for ambush.
We reached Kamenka at dusk. The village was larger than I'd expected, perhaps 80 houses, and it sat in a clearing surrounded on 3 sides by forest. As we approached, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The village seemed completely deserted. No smoke from chimneys, no animals in the yards, no lights in windows. The detachment commander, a regular Red Army officer named Kostin, ordered a halt. He sent scouts ahead. They returned 10 minutes later. Village is empty, Comrade Commander. Looks like they fled into the forest, recently. There are still warm ashes in some stoves. Kostin's jaw tightened. Search every building. Find anything that tells us where they went. What followed was systematic destruction dressed up as a search. Soldiers broke down doors, overturned furniture, smashed icons, and pulled up floorboards. They found almost nothing, some old tools, a few hidden potatoes, religious items that were confiscated as contraband. The grain stores were completely empty. I walked through the village in the failing light, recording the search. Most of the houses were simple wooden structures, 1 or 2 rooms, built in the traditional style with carved window frames and small vegetable plots. They had been abandoned in haste. I saw half-eaten meals on tables, children's toys scattered on floors, a samovar still sitting on a cold stove. In one house, I found something that made me stop. On the wall, written in charcoal, were the words, "We will not starve for your revolution." I stood there for a long moment, staring at those words. Then I heard Baranov behind me. "Document it," he said. "Evidence of counter-revolutionary sentiment." I wrote it in my ledger, word for word. My hand shook slightly as I wrote. That night, the detachment made camp in the village square. Fires were lit, sentries posted. The mood was tense. Everyone knew that if the peasants had fled into the forest, they hadn't gone far. They were out there, watching, waiting. I sat near one of the fires, trying to warm my hands. Kostin stood nearby, conferring with his officers in low voices. I caught fragments. Can't chase them into the forest in winter. Need to make an example. Burn the village. I must have reacted because one of the officers noticed me listening. "Something to say, Comrade Clerk?" "No, comrade," I replied quickly. "I'm just recording." "Then record this," Kostin said, turning to face me. "Tomorrow we burn Kamenka, every structure. The provincial committee has authorized it. Villages that support bandits will be destroyed. It's the only language they understand." I opened my mouth to object, then closed it. What could I say? That burning the village would create more rebels, not fewer. That these were people pushed to desperation, not bandits. That this would be remembered as atrocity, not justice. I said nothing. I wrote it in my ledger. November 4th, 1920. Commander Kostin orders destruction of Kamenka village. Authorization from provincial committee. Kamenka burned the next morning. The soldiers used kerosene and torches. The wooden houses caught quickly, the flames spreading from roof to roof until the entire village was ablaze. The smoke rose in a thick black column that could be seen for versts around. I stood at the edge of the clearing and watched, my ledger open but forgotten. The heat was intense even at a distance. I thought about the charcoal message on the wall. "We will not starve for your revolution," burning now, turning to ash and smoke. As we marched back to Kirsanov that afternoon, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. Nailed to a tree by the road was a proclamation, handwritten on a sheet of rough paper. "To all peasants of Tambov province, we are the Union of Toiling Peasants. We resist the Bolshevik grain theft. We will not watch our children starve while commissars feast. Join us in the forest. Bring weapons if you have them, courage if you do not. We fight under the green banner against the red terror, for land and freedom, for bread and justice." The proclamation was signed with a name I didn't recognize, Alexander Antonov. Kostin ordered it torn down and burned, but I had already memorized it. That night, I wrote it word for word in my private notebook. The rebellion grew through November, like a flame catching in dry grass. More villages reported attacks on requisition squads. More grain was seized back from Soviet stores. The rebels began calling themselves the Greens, green for the forest that sheltered them, for the land they claimed to defend. The name Antonov appeared more and more frequently in reports. Alexander Stepanovich Antonov, former member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, veteran of 1917, now fugitive and rebel leader. The descriptions varied, but the pattern was clear. He was organizing the scattered resistance into something more coordinated, more dangerous. By late November, the Greens controlled significant portions of the countryside. They attacked supply columns, raided granaries, executed commissars they captured. The Red Army response was brutal. More villages burned, hostages taken, summary executions. But the rebellion continued to spread. I watched it unfold from my desk in the schoolhouse, recording it all. The numbers in my ledger told a story of escalating violence. Requisitions met with resistance. Resistance met with reprisals. Reprisals breeding more resistance. It was a spiral, and I couldn't see how it would end. In early December, Baranov came to my office with new orders. "We're requisitioning from Afanasyevka again. Intelligence suggests they're providing supplies to the Greens." "We already took their seed grain," I said. "What's left to requisition?" "Whatever they've hidden, or managed to grow since, or received from relatives in other villages. The quota must be met, Arsenyev." We returned to Afanasyevka on December 8th with a larger squad, 20 soldiers, 6 Cheka agents, 3 carts. The village looked different than it had in October, thinner somehow. The people who watched us enter the square had the gaunt look of chronic hunger. The search was more invasive this time. Not just cellars and lofts, but gardens dug up, wells probed, even the church examined. In Volkov's house, they found a small cache of potatoes buried under the floor of his barn, perhaps half a pud. Volkov didn't argue this time. He simply watched as they loaded the potatoes onto a cart. His wife stood behind him, and I noticed she was crying silently, tears running down her face while she made no sound. As we prepared to leave, a young man stepped forward from the crowd. I didn't recognize him, probably too young to have been my student. He couldn't have been more than 20. "You'll regret this," he said to Baranov. "All of you. You think you can starve us and we'll just accept it? You're wrong. We're joining the Greens. All of us who can fight." One of the Cheka agents moved toward him, but Baranov raised a hand. "Let him speak. Let everyone hear." The young man's voice rose. "You come here with guns and take food from children's mouths. You burn villages and call it justice. You serve masters in Moscow who've never been hungry a day in their lives. Well, we're done. We'd rather die fighting than starve quietly." "And you'll get your wish," Baranov said calmly. "The penalty for joining an armed rebellion is death. I'm showing mercy by not arresting you right now. But when we catch you in the forest, and we will catch you, there will be no trial, no mercy. You'll be shot like a dog." "Better a dog with dignity than a slave with a full belly," the young man replied, "which you don't even offer us." That night, 3 families disappeared from Afanasyevka. We learned this the next day from informants. They had slipped away in darkness and gone into the forest to join the Greens. I wrote it in my ledger. I wrote all of it. The potatoes taken from Volkov, the young man's defiance, the families fleeing. And then I sat alone in my room and tried to understand how we had arrived at this point, where hunger and fear had pushed ordinary people to take up arms against the state I served. I thought about my years teaching, about the children I had tried to educate, to prepare for citizenship in a better Russia. I thought about what we had promised them: bread, peace, land, justice. And then I thought about what we had delivered: hunger, violence, confiscation, terror. Somewhere in the forest around Tambov, those children were now loading rifles, and I was on the other side, counting potatoes in a ledger. Winter deepened, and with it, the war in the countryside became something darker and more desperate than I had imagined possible. By January 1921, the rebellion had spread across most of Tambov province. Antonov's forces, still called the Greens, still claiming to fight under peasant banners, controlled entire districts. They had evolved from scattered bands into something resembling an army, with organized units, supply lines, even a crude form of administration in areas they held. The Soviet response escalated in proportion. General Tukhachevsky was sent from Moscow to take command, bringing thousands of Red Army troops, special Cheka detachments, and new, harsher orders. The schoolhouse where I worked had been converted again, this time into a regional command post. My small corner remained, but now it was surrounded by military maps, telephone lines, and the constant traffic of officers and couriers. I had been promoted, in a manner of speaking. I was now special clerk to the district committee, a title that meant I recorded not just requisitions, but interrogations, executions, and the detailed accounting of what was euphemistically termed pacification operations. The work was destroying me. I could feel it happening, like ice forming inside my chest, thickening day by day. Each entry in my ledger was another small death of conscience, but I continued. What choice did I have? Desertion meant execution. Refusal meant arrest. And besides, someone had to record it. Someone had to remember what we were doing here, even if that memory was damning. On January 23rd, I was called to witness an interrogation. The subject was a captured green fighter, brought in during the night from a village called Verkhovskoye. His name was Stepan Rudakov. He was 17 years old. The interrogation took place in what had once been the schoolhouse cellar, the same cellar where we used to store firewood and teaching supplies. Now it smelled of blood and fear. The Cheka interrogator was a man named Stutzman. I never learned his first name, and I never asked. He was perhaps 40, with pale eyes and hands that were always steady. His voice when he spoke was almost gentle, which somehow made everything worse. Your name is Stepan Rudakov, Stutzman said. It wasn't a question. The boy, and he was a boy despite his attempt to grow a beard, nodded. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. His hands were bound behind him. You are a member of the bandit group led by the criminal Antonov. I'm a member of the Union of Toiling Peasants, Stepan said. His voice shook, but he got the words out. We're not bandits. We're defending our families. From what? From starvation. From you. Stutzman nodded as if this was a reasonable answer. Tell me about your unit's organization. How many fighters? Where are they based? What are their weapons? I won't betray my comrades. You will. Eventually, everyone does. The only question is how much you suffer first. What followed I will not describe in detail. I recorded it in my ledger. I had to. It was my duty. But I will not reproduce it here. Suffice it to say that Stutzman was skilled at his work, and that Stepan Rudakov, despite his courage, was still a 17-year-old boy. He broke after 2 hours, gave up locations of camps, names of unit commanders, details of weapons caches. I wrote it all down, my hand cramping, my spectacles fogging in the cellar's damp heat. When it was over, Stutzman ordered Stepan taken to the holding cells. He would be shot the next morning. That was standard procedure for captured rebels. No trial necessary. As the guards dragged him out, Stepan looked at me. Our eyes met for a moment. He was crying. Whether from pain or shame, I couldn't tell. You're the teacher, he said suddenly. From Kirsanov. You taught my older brother, Pyotr Rudakov. Do you remember him? I did. Pyotr had been a clever student, good at history. He had wanted to go to university before the war intervened. I remember, I said quietly. He's dead now. Died in 1918 at the front. And now me. Our whole family. For what? His voice rose. For a revolution that steals our bread? For a government that burns our homes? That's enough, one of the guards said, shoving him toward the stairs. Stepan stumbled, caught himself. You're worse than the interrogator, he said, looking back at me. At least he knows he's evil. You pretend you're just following orders, just recording. But you're the one who makes it all seem normal. You're the one who writes it down like it's arithmetic, instead of murder. They pulled him up the stairs. I sat alone in the cellar for a long time after, staring at my ledger. The page was full of information that would be used to hunt down more rebels, destroy more camps, execute more 17-year-old boys. Stepan Rudakov was shot the next morning. I didn't witness it. I wasn't required to. But I recorded it. January 24th, 1921. Stepan Rudakov, age 17, executed for armed rebellion against the Soviet state. The raids intensified through February. Tukhachevsky's strategy was clear. Systematic destruction of the rebellion's base of support. Villages suspected of aiding the Greens were surrounded, their adult male populations arrested en masse. Hostages were taken, family members of known rebels, sometimes simply people chosen at random. The hostages were held in camps outside Tambov city, told they would be released when the fighting stopped. I saw the lists of hostages. I recorded them. Old men, women, children as young as 10. Thousands of them, living in unheated barracks, given minimal rations, many dying of cold and disease. In early March, Tukhachevsky issued new orders. Villages that continued to support the rebellion would face extraordinary measures. I saw the order in writing. It was remarkably bureaucratic in tone, given what it authorized. The first application of these extraordinary measures came on March 7th in a village called Tugolukovo. The village had been identified as a major supply point for Antonov's forces. A detachment was sent to pacify it. I was not present for the operation itself, thank God for small mercies, but I saw the report afterward. I was required to file it to ensure it was properly archived. The report was written in the flat, efficient prose of military documentation. March 7th, 1921. Tugolukovo. Population approximately 280. Suspected of providing material support to bandits. Village surrounded at dawn. All residents ordered to assembly point in square. Adult males, 47 total, separated for interrogation. Resistance encountered. Warning shots fired. Continued resistance. Example made necessary. All adult males executed. Remaining population relocated to holding camp. Village structures destroyed to prevent future use by bandits. I read those words over and over, trying to make them mean something other than what they clearly meant. 47 men executed. An entire village destroyed. And the language of the report made it sound like a solved problem, a completed task, numbers balanced in a ledger. I thought about the 17-year-old boy in the cellar. His accusation echoed, "You're the one who writes it down like it's arithmetic instead of murder." That night, I did something I had never done before. I got drunk. Properly drunk, not just a few glasses of vodka to warm the blood. I found a bottle of Samagon, illegal homebrewed alcohol, that one of the soldiers was selling, and I drank until the room spun and the words in my ledger blurred into meaningless scratches. It didn't help. In the morning, I was sick and hungover, and the words were still there, clear as ever. March wore on with a grinding sameness. More raids, more villages destroyed, more executions. The Greens fought back where they could, but they were being slowly crushed. Their supply lines were cut, their villages were burned or occupied. Their numbers dwindled as fighters were killed or captured, or simply gave up and tried to disappear into what remained of the countryside. I recorded all of it, meticulously, accurately, completely. It was my job, my duty to the revolution, my contribution to building the new world. Sometimes I wondered if anyone would ever read these records. If someday, perhaps long after I was dead, someone would open these ledgers and try to understand what had happened here, what we had done. I wondered what they would think of us, of me. On March 19th, I recorded an order that made my hands shake. The authorization for poison gas, chemical weapons, to be used against rebels hiding in the forests. The order came from Tukhachevsky himself, approved by the provincial committee. I sat staring at those words for an hour. Poison gas. We were going to use poison gas against our own peasants, against Russians, against people whose only crime was trying to prevent their families from starving. I thought about burning the order, about losing it in the bureaucratic shuffle. But it wouldn't matter. There were copies, other records. And besides, I was just the clerk, just the recorder. The order would be carried out whether I documented it or not. So I documented it. I recorded it in my neat, careful handwriting. And then I went back to my room and was sick again, though I hadn't been drinking. The gas was never used, as it turned out. The rebels retreated from the forest positions before it could be deployed. But the fact that we had authorized it, that we had been willing to do it, that seemed significant. There were lines we had been willing to cross, and we had crossed them so gradually that we barely noticed when we stepped over them. By late March, the rebellion was clearly dying. Antonov's forces had been broken into scattered bands. The villages were cowed or destroyed. The hostages had served their purpose.
Those who survived were released to return to homes that often no longer existed. The requisitions continued. The quotas still had to be met. The cities still needed grain. The revolution still demanded feeding. I continued filling my ledgers. The numbers mounted, grain requisitioned, villages destroyed, executions carried out, hostages taken, hostages released, hostages dead. I was 38 years old and I felt ancient. My hands shook constantly now. I had developed a cough that wouldn't go away. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time without waking from dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me gasping and sweating. On March 28th, Fyodor, the young soldier who had asked me about his cousin's wife back in October, didn't return from a patrol. We learned later that his unit had been ambushed by a remnant Green Band near Verkhovskoy. 8 soldiers killed. Fyodor was one of them. I recorded it. March 28th, 1921. Red Army soldier Fyodor Sergeyevich Markov, killed in action against bandits near Verkhovskoy. I had taught Fyodor's mother, years ago, in another lifetime. I would have to write to her, I thought, tell her something that would make sense of her son's death. But what could I possibly say? That he died for the revolution? That he died to ensure the cities got their grain? That he died because we had created a situation where young men were sent to take food from desperate people at gunpoint, and those desperate people fought back? I never wrote the letter. I don't know what happened to Fyodor's mother. I hope she never learned that I had been there, that I had recorded her son's death in the same ledger where I recorded requisitions and executions and the systematic destruction of the countryside.
April brought a thaw, and with the melting snow came the full horror of what winter had wrought. The mud season turned the roads into nearly impassable tracks, but it also revealed what had been hidden under snow. Bodies, mostly. Frozen corpses of those who had died fleeing destroyed villages, or trying to reach family in other districts, or simply giving up and lying down in the cold. I was assigned to accompany a survey team assessing the agricultural capacity of the province. The purpose was to calculate realistic grain quotas for the coming year, though realistic had become a word emptied of meaning. What was realistic when half the villages were destroyed or depopulated, when the seed grain had been requisitioned, when the draft animals had been slaughtered for food or seized for military transport? We traveled from district to district, the survey team and I, recording what remained. My role was to compile the data, to create reports that would go to Tambov City and from there to Moscow. Numbers and statistics that would determine how much more could be extracted from a countryside that had already been bled white. The first village we assessed was called Novospasskaya. It sat in a valley between low hills, perhaps 70 houses arranged around the usual central square. Before the war, it had been moderately prosperous. Good soil, access to a small river for irrigation. I had been there once before, years ago, to deliver textbooks to the village teacher. We arrived on April 12th to find approximately half the village abandoned. The remaining inhabitants, perhaps 200 people, had a skeletal look. Not the gauntness of temporary hunger, but the deep wasting of prolonged starvation. Children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs. Old people who moved with painful slowness. Adults whose eyes held a peculiar emptiness, as if they had already died inside and their bodies simply hadn't noticed yet. The village elder was a man named Belov, perhaps 60 but looking 20 years older. He greeted our survey team with weary resignation. "There's nothing left to take," he said without preamble. "You've already taken everything." The survey team leader, an agronomist named Volkov, no relation to the Volkov I knew in Afanasyevka, consulted his papers. According to our records, Novospaska was requisitioned for 40 puds of grain total in 1920. That's well below the average for villages of this size. You took our seed grain in October, Belov replied. Then you came back in December and took the rye we'd hidden for spring planting. Then in February, your soldiers took 3 cows and 17 chickens, all the livestock we had left. So yes, only 40 puds of grain by your count. But it was everything we had. And now it's spring, and we have nothing to plant. Volkov made notes. How many households are currently occupied? 35. Population? Maybe 200. We had 420 before the winter. Some fled to the forest. Some died. Some we buried. Some we couldn't bury because the ground was frozen. I wrote this in my ledger, though my hand was shaking again. It shook almost constantly now, a tremor that made my writing less neat than it had once been. How many draft animals? Volkov continued. None. None? All taken or slaughtered. We have 2 old horses that are too sick to work. Otherwise, nothing. Agricultural implements? Some. Not enough. Your soldiers took most of the metal tools back in December, said they needed them for the war effort. Volkov sighed. He was not a cool man. I had come to know him over the past week. He was simply doing his job, trying to calculate what remained. I'll recommend a reduced quota for Novospaska in the spring requisition. 20 puds. Belov laughed, though there was no humor in it. 20 puds. From fields we can't plow, with animals we don't have, using seed we weren't allowed to keep. Tell me, how does that work in your ledger? That's not my concern, Volkov said, though his voice was gentle. I just assess capacity. Others make the policy decisions. We moved through the village, examining cellars and storage buildings, counting sacks and measuring grain stores. We found almost nothing. The people had been telling the truth. They had been stripped bare. In one house, I saw something that made me stop. A small child, perhaps 4 years old, sitting on the floor playing with wooden blocks. But the blocks weren't toys. They were pieces of bark carved into rough shapes. And the child wasn't playing exactly. She was chewing on one of the bark pieces, gnawing it slowly like it might contain some nutrition. Her mother saw me watching. It's just to keep her mouth busy, she said, so she doesn't cry about being hungry. The crying is difficult. I had nothing to say to that. I made a note in my ledger. I don't even remember what I wrote. Then we moved on. We visited 17 villages over the next 2 weeks. The pattern repeated with minor variations. Abandoned houses, skeletal survivors, empty granaries, fields that wouldn't be planted, livestock gone, the aged and the very young dying first, the way they always do in famines. In some villages, we saw evidence of improvised survival strategies. People had stripped bark from trees to boil into a kind of soup. They had dug up roots from the forest. They had caught birds and field mice and anything else that moved. They had eaten their dogs and cats. They had eaten things I will not describe. The survey reports I compiled made for grim reading. I estimated that perhaps 30% of the province's agricultural capacity had been destroyed, some from direct action in suppressing the rebellion, some from the loss of livestock and tools, some from the simple fact that seed grain had been requisitioned and there was nothing to plant. I tried to write this clearly, to make it impossible for anyone reading the report to misunderstand the implications. If we continued requisitioning at 1920 levels, there would be massive famine. Not just hunger, actual famine, with mass starvation. The report went to Tambov City in late April. I never received a response. The requisition quotas for spring 1921 were set at approximately 80% of 1920 levels. which meant we were still going to take more than the countryside could give. In early May, something happened that I had not experienced before. I refused an order. Not openly, not dramatically, but I refused nonetheless. I was told to accompany a punitive expedition to a village called Bugorodskoye. Intelligence suggested that the village was sheltering Green fighters. The expedition would search for rebels and, if resistance was encountered, apply necessary measures. I knew what necessary measures meant. I had been recording them for months. I told Baranov I was ill. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had been coughing blood for several days, and my hands shook so badly I could barely write. He looked at me skeptically, but let it pass. I think he knew I was breaking, and he didn't want to have to deal with it. The expedition went without me. They found no rebels in Bugorodskoye, but they found a cache of grain that hadn't been reported in the spring requisition. The village was punished. I learned the details later from the reports I was required to file, but I hadn't witnessed it. That small distance felt important, even though I knew it was meaningless. I was a coward. I had been a coward for months, perhaps years. I had told myself I was just recording, just following orders, just doing my duty. But Stepan Rudikov had been right in that cellar. I was the one who made it all seem normal. I was the one who transformed atrocity into administrative procedure. Without people like me, clerks and accountants and dutiful scribes, the machinery of repression couldn't function. The rebellion was effectively over by mid-May. Antonov himself was still at large. He would remain so for another year, I later learned, but his forces were scattered and powerless. The Greens had been crushed not by military genius, but by systematic brutality. The destruction of their base of support, the burning of their villages, the execution of their fighters and anyone suspected of helping them. The cost had been extraordinary. I knew the numbers because I had recorded them. Thousands dead in combat, thousands more executed, tens of thousands displaced, their villages destroyed. And now, with spring planting season upon us and no seed grain to plant, thousands more would die of hunger in the coming year. This was victory. This was pacification. This was the revolution defending itself. On May 28th, I was called to Baranov's office. I expected another assignment, another requisition, another opportunity to add numbers to my ledgers. Instead, he handed me a letter. "You're being transferred," he said, "to Tambov City. The provincial archive needs experienced clerks to organize records." I stared at the letter. Why? "You've done good work here. Thorough documentation. They need that in the city." He paused. "Also, you're clearly ill. The work here is hard. The city will be easier." It was a kindness in its way. He was removing me before I completely broke, before my evident distress became too obvious to ignore. Better to transfer the problem than deal with it. "When do I leave?" I asked. 3 days. Pack your things." I returned to my room and looked at my belongings. They were few, some clothes, my books, my ledgers, both official and private. The private notebooks I had been keeping, my record of what had really happened here. They were dangerous to keep. If anyone found them, read what I had written, but I couldn't destroy them. They were the only honest accounting that existed, the only record that didn't reduce everything to numbers and euphemisms. I packed them carefully, buried deep in my bag where no casual search would find them. On my last morning in Kirsanov, I walked through the town one final time. The market square where I had taught children their letters, the schoolhouse where I had recorded so much suffering, the streets where people I had known now avoided my gaze. I thought about all the villages I had visited, all the faces I had seen, all the names I had written in ledgers. I thought about Stepan Rudakov crying in a cellar, about Fyodor Markov killed in an ambush, about the little girl chewing bark, about Volkov's trembling hands and Darya's silent tears and the old woman's curse. I had been complicit in all of it. Not directly. I had never personally confiscated grain or burned a house or executed a prisoner. But I had been the mechanism that made it possible, the bureaucracy that transformed individual tragedies into administrative statistics. The cart that would take me to Tambov City was waiting. I climbed aboard, my bag of possessions beside me, my ledgers carefully stored. As we left Kirsanov, I looked back once at the town disappearing behind us. I never returned. And in all the years that followed, I never stopped seeing those faces, never stopped hearing those voices, never stopped feeling the weight of what I had been part of. Tambov City in the summer of 1921 was a place of bureaucratic fever, a center grinding through the aftermath of rebellion with the methodical efficiency of an abattoir processing meat. I arrived in early June and was immediately assigned to the provincial archive, a warren of rooms in a former merchant's mansion, now filled with filing cabinets and shelves sagging under the weight of documents. My job, ostensibly, was to organize and catalog the records from the rebellion's suppression. In practice, it meant making sense of chaos. Reports arrived in no particular order. Interrogation transcripts mixed with requisition receipts, execution lists alongside agricultural surveys, casualty reports filed next to grain quotas. It was my task to sort this cacophony of suffering into a coherent archive, to create an ordered record of the past year's violence. The work was suffocating. Not physically, the archive rooms were actually better than the schoolhouse in Kirsanov, with real desks and adequate lighting, but psychologically. Every document I cataloged was a small weight added to an already crushing burden. I was surrounded by paper monuments to horror, and my role was to organize them neatly. I was not alone. The archive employed 6 other clerks, mostly older men like myself who had been transferred from district work. We rarely spoke to each other beyond what was necessary for coordination. I think we all understood, without saying it, that we were damaged in similar ways. We were the record keepers of atrocity, and that knowledge had marked us. My immediate supervisor was a woman named Elizaveta Mikhailovna Krasnova. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back severely and spectacles that made her eyes look enormous. She'd been a librarian before the revolution and approached her new work with the same meticulous care she had once applied to cataloging books. "The archive must be complete," she told me on my first day. "Complete and accurate. What we record here will be the official history. It must be done properly." I understood what she meant. We were not just organizing documents, we were creating the story that would be told about the Tambov Rebellion, the official narrative, the version that would survive in Soviet records while the lived reality faded into memory and then into nothing. "Should it be accurate?" I asked her. "Or should it be complete? Those might not be the same thing." She gave me a sharp look. "Do your work, Arsenyev. Organize what you're given. That's all that's required." So I organized. I created filing systems. I cross-referenced reports. I compiled statistics. The numbers were staggering when aggregated. Villages destroyed, 157. Executions documented, 2,347. Hostages held, 13,441. Hostages deceased in custody, 876. Total estimated rebellion casualties, 15,000 to 20,000. Estimated civilian deaths from associated famine and displacement, unknown, possibly 50,000 plus. These figures appeared in my reports as simple data points, numbers in columns, facts to be cataloged. But behind each number I saw faces,
The 17-year-old in the cellar, the child chewing bark, the old woman's curse, the way Volkov's hands had trembled.
The archive, I began to realize, was not a record of what had happened. It was a sanitized, bureaucratized version that transformed human suffering into administrative categories. The screams and blood and terror were reduced to pacification operations. The starvation was requisition fulfillment. The murdered villagers were executed bandits. I had been doing this all along in my ledgers, of course, but seeing it at scale, watching months of violence compressed into neat files and statistical summaries, made the mechanism visible in a way it hadn't been before. In July, I was assigned a special project, compiling a comprehensive report on the rebellion's economic impact. Specifically, calculating the cost of suppression versus the grain value secured through requisitions. A cost-benefit analysis of crushing a peasant revolt. The work took 3 weeks. I pulled data from hundreds of documents, cross-referenced figures, calculated averages and totals. The mathematics were straightforward. The moral implications were nauseating. The rebellion had cost the Soviet state approximately 47 million rubles to suppress. Military operations, lost productivity, destroyed infrastructure, compensation for fallen Red Army soldiers. The grain requisitioned from Tambov province in 1920 to 1921, valued at average market prices, came to approximately 65 million rubles. Therefore, the suppression had been economically efficient. We had profited, in strictly monetary terms, from the violence. The spreadsheet said so. The numbers proved it. I submitted the report to Elizaveta Mikhailovna. She reviewed it and nodded approvingly. Excellent work. This will be useful for the provincial committee. Useful how? I asked. To demonstrate that firm action against counter-revolutionary elements produces results. That the requisition system, properly enforced, functions as intended. I went back to my desk and was quietly sick in a wastebasket. That evening, I did something I had avoided for weeks. I began reading through the interrogation transcripts, not to catalog them, but to actually read what people had said. The testimony of captured rebels before they were executed, their explanations for why they had fought. One transcript in particular haunted me. A man named Sergei Volkov, possibly related to Grigory Volkov from Afanasyevka, though I couldn't be certain, interrogated on March 15th, 1921. Why did you join the bandits? They're not bandits. We're defending our families. From what? From you? From starvation. Last year you took our harvest, then you took our seed grain. My children were eating boiled grass. My daughter died in February. She was 5 years old. I buried her myself. So yes, I joined the union. I would do it again. You understand you'll be executed. I understand. But at least I'll die having tried to do something, instead of just watching my family starve. That's all you have to say? No. I want to say one more thing, for your record. Tell whoever reads this, we were good people. We worked hard. We loved our children. We tried to be loyal to Russia. But you made it impossible. You took everything and called it revolution. You killed us and called it progress. When they judge you, and someone will judge you someday, remember that we were the ones who tried to resist. We were the ones who said no. And you killed us for it. The transcript ended there. Below, in different handwriting, Sergei Volkov, executed March 16, 1921. Sentence carried out per directive. After he left, I added a note to my private record. August 15th, 1921. Baranov visits. Still believes. Perhaps that's easier than the alternative. The work continued through fall and into winter. The archive grew. More documents arrived, more reports to be filed, more violence to be transformed into statistics and summaries. I cataloged them all, and at night I continued writing my own account. By December, I had filled 3 notebooks with my private record: testimony, observations, incidents that wouldn't appear in the official archive. I kept them wrapped in oilcloth, hidden behind a loose board in my room. Someday, I told myself, they would matter. Someday someone would want to know the truth. In late December, Elizaveta Mikhailovna called me to her office. "The Provincial Committee is pleased with the archive's progress," she said. "They're recommending you for a commendation, for thorough and dedicated service." A commendation, a medal probably, for helping to organize the record of mass murder and starvation. "That's not necessary," I said. "It's already decided. The ceremony is in February." I accepted it because refusing would have been suspicious. In February 1922, in a drab ceremony at the Provincial Committee headquarters, I received a certificate and a small medal for outstanding service to the revolution. I wore it for the ceremony, then put it in a drawer where I never looked at it again. The summer of 1922 brought a famine that dwarfed everything that had come before. The warnings had been there for months, evident in the reports I catalogued. The seed grain requisitioned in 1920 had never been replaced. The 1921 harvest had been poor, both from reduced planting and from drought. The livestock had been depleted. The villages were depopulated. Every indicator pointed to catastrophe. But the requisitions had continued anyway. The cities needed to be fed. The revolution needed to be fed. The countryside would simply have to manage. It couldn't manage. By June, the famine was undeniable. By July, people were dying by the thousands. By August, Tambov province looked like a landscape from an apocalypse. I was sent back to the countryside as part of a relief assessment team. A bitter irony. I had spent months recording the requisitions that helped cause this famine, and now I was being sent to record its effects. We traveled through districts I had visited in 1920 and 1921. They were unrecognizable. Villages that had been merely hungry were now charnel houses. The living were too weak to bury the dead. Children with distended bellies and vacant eyes sat in the streets. The smell of death was everywhere. In Afanasyevka, I found Grigory Volkov's house empty. The neighbors who remained, and they were few, told me that Volkov and his wife had died in May. Their children had been sent to an orphanage in Tambov city. The house stood open, the door hanging on one hinge, everything of value long since traded or stolen or consumed. I stood in that empty house and thought about the man I had seen 2 years earlier, watching as we took his seed grain. His trembling hands, his wife's silent tears. They had died of the famine we had created, as surely as if we had shot them. The assessment team compiled its report in August. The numbers were staggering. An estimated 1.5 million people in Tambov province at risk of starvation. Perhaps 100,000 already dead. The infrastructure of agricultural life had been systematically destroyed, villages burned, livestock gone, tools requisitioned, seed grain taken. Recovery, if it was possible at all, would take years. I wrote the report. I organized the statistics. I transformed mass death into administrative language. Again. But something had broken in me. Some last thread of self-deception had finally snapped. I could no longer pretend that I was just a recorder, just a clerk following orders. I had been part of the mechanism. I had enabled it with my dutiful record-keeping, my neat ledgers, my organized files. Stepan Rudakov had been right. Sergei Volkov had been right. The old woman who cursed us had been right. In September, I submitted a request for leave from my position. I claimed ill health, which was true enough. I was coughing blood regularly now. My hands shook constantly, and I had developed a nervous condition that made sleep nearly impossible. The request was granted. I think they were relieved to be rid of me. I had become obviously unstable, muttering to myself, flinching at loud noises, staring at documents as if I could see the blood behind the words. I left Tambov City in October 1922 and traveled to Moscow. I had some vague idea of, I'm not sure what, confession, testimony, finding someone in the party hierarchy who would listen, who would care that we had starved a province to feed the cities. I found no one, or rather, everyone I found already knew. The famine was not a secret. The requisitions were policy. The deaths were acceptable costs. The revolution ground on, and people like me were simply grit in the machinery. I lived in Moscow for 3 months in a cramped room in a communal apartment. I spent my days walking the streets and my nights writing. Not organizing now, not cataloging, but trying to make sense of what had happened. Trying to understand how we had arrived at this place where starving peasants to death had become administrative procedure. I never found an answer that satisfied me. The revolution had needed grain. The cities had needed food. The alternative was letting the cities starve, letting the revolution fail. So the countryside had been requisitioned, and when the countryside resisted, it had been pacified. The logic was impeccable. The cost was merely everything. In December, I finally opened my private notebooks, all of them, including the ones I had copied and the ones I had written in Moscow. I read them through from beginning to end. It took 2 days. They were a record of disintegration, not just of the countryside, but of myself. I could see it in my own handwriting, in the way my entries became more desperate, more fragmented, more haunted. I had documented my own complicity page by page. I considered burning them. No one else would ever read them. Keeping them was dangerous, and I had nowhere to hide them safely. They would be found eventually, and I would be arrested for keeping unofficial records, for documenting things that should remain hidden. But I couldn't destroy them. They were the only honest accounting that existed, the only record that didn't reduce people to numbers, that didn't transform atrocity into administrative language. They were testimony, even if they would never be heard. I found a printer, a small, illegal operation that produced anti-government pamphlets. I paid him most of my remaining money to make multiple copies of my most important entries. Not all of them, that would have been impossible, but key sections. Testimony, incidents, the human cost behind the statistics. I sent these copies to people I barely knew, former teachers, distant relatives, anyone I thought might keep them hidden. I sent them wrapped in innocuous covers, disguised as family letters or recipe collections. Most were probably destroyed immediately, but perhaps 1 or 2 survived. Perhaps somewhere, in some forgotten drawer or hidden attic, one of those copies still exists. In January 1923, my illness worsened dramatically. The coughing was constant, and the blood was now mixed with something darker. I knew I was dying, probably tuberculosis, though I never sought medical confirmation. The revolution's hospitals had enough real workers to care for. There was no room for failed clerks who had cataloged their own damnation. I returned to Tambov City in February, though I'm not sure why. Perhaps because it was the closest thing I had to a home. Perhaps because I wanted to die near the archive, near the records I had helped create. Elizaveta Mikhailovna visited me once in the hospital ward, where I had finally been admitted. She brought a small basket of apples, a luxury in those years, and sat by my bed. "You kept other records, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer. "It doesn't matter now," she continued. "You're dying, and the war is over. The rebellion is history. The famine is passing. What's written is written." "Is that enough?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "To just write it and file it away? What else is there? Truth, memory, accountability." She smiled sadly. "Those are luxuries, Mikhail Ivanovich. The revolution doesn't deal in luxuries. It deals in necessities. Grain, power, order. The rest is just paper." After she left, I lay in the hospital bed and thought about paper. About all the paper I had filled with words, official ledgers and private notebooks, requisition reports and secret testimony, statistics and stories. Paper burns, paper decays, paper gets lost or destroyed or filed away where no one will ever read it. I had spent years trying to record what happened, but what good was a record if no one would see it? If the official version was all that survived? My name is Mikhail Arsenyev, and I used to believe that words could save us. I don't believe that anymore. Words are just sounds, just marks on paper. They have no power against hunger or bullets or the machinery of the state grinding forward. All my careful records, all my private testimony, all my attempts to preserve the truth, they meant nothing in the end. But I wrote them anyway, because someone had to, because Sergei Volkov asked for his words to be remembered, because the children with distended bellies and the burning villages and the trembling hands and the silent tears deserved more than to be forgotten, even if remembering changes nothing. I am dying in a hospital bed in Tambov City in March 1923. I am 39 years old, and I feel ancient. My hands still shake. I still see faces when I close my eyes. I still hear voices. The rebellion is over. The villages are destroyed or pacified. The requisitions continue, though they call them something else now. The archive grows, organizing the past into neat categories while the present grinds on. And somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten drawer, perhaps in an attic, perhaps lost forever, there are notebooks filled with the truth. Not the official truth, but the truth of what it felt like to watch a village burn. To record the execution of a 17-year-old boy. To take seed grain from a family who would starve without it. The truth of what we did to each other in the name of revolution, in the name of necessity, in the name of feeding the cities while the countryside died. Someone may read this someday, or no one may ever read it. It doesn't matter. It's written. It exists. That's all I can do. That's all any of us can do. Remember that we were here. Remember what happened. Remember that it mattered. Even if no one remembers. Especially then.